Chelsea. This is my channel, The Fancy Hat Lady Reads. I am wearing one of my fancy booktube hats, and today I am doing another catch-up wrap-up. I am doing catch-up wrap-ups because there were a bunch of months where I was very overwhelmed with a lot of things that were happening, and I didn't manage to do wrap-ups, which are the videos that take the most effort for me on my channel, even when I was managing to produce some easier content. So this is my catch-up wrap-up for November 2018. I will link my last one, which was for October. My other most recent wrap-up that I've posted was a 5-star predictions wrap-up and a new 5-star TBR predictions TBR. That one I am also going to link for you because apparently because of screw-up things that happened in the upload of that one, it didn't show up in anyone's subscription feeds, but it is on my channel. If you missed it, you can watch it. But because the books that I'm wrapping up today are things that I finished back in November, I'm not going to promise incredible amounts of plot details. I might not remember as much specific information about the character or the stories as I usually do when I wrap books up, but I do want to give you a pretty good idea of how I felt about the reading experience. There are going to be 4 books on this list. I actually finished 6 books in November, but one of them, Blanca y Roja by Anna Marie McLemore, which was also one of my 5-star TBR predictions I've talked about in several other videos before, including a book comparison that I did with that one and The Sisters of the Winter Wood by Rena Rosner. So I'll link that. I don't feel like I need to wrap it up again. It's come up in a bunch of different recommendation videos and such. Since then, I am done talking about that book. And then the other one is one that's also come up in some recommendation videos, but I still owe you a full review of it, which is In the Vanisher's Palace by Aliette de Bodard. I'm not going to talk about either one of those here. Hopefully that will make it easier on myself to only have to talk about 4 books. So the first book that I finished in November was my Halloween read that I was reading on October 31st for the spooky season, and then I ended up finishing it at the beginning of November. It's a Tor.com novella, and it is Witches of Lychford by Paul Cornell, which is the first in an urban fantasy series about a small English town called Lychford and its magical happenings. So I think I may have gone into this one with my expectations a bit too high because I had seen nothing but like glowing, effusive praise of this book. So I didn't know what exactly it was that was going to be so brilliant about this novella, but like I went in expecting brilliance. And there was nothing wrong with it whatsoever, but it was sort of nothing special for me. There are definitely some things to strongly recommend this book. It's about a trio of 3 female characters, all very different from one another, who end up being forced to kind of come together and work together to form a coven of sorts to face down a magical threat. The threat comes in the form of a supermarket, which wants to open up a location that is positioned just so on the map of the town that magical balances will be destroyed and all hell will break loose. So there is some economic commentary on big chain stores pushing out small businesses and such. But an older woman in town named Judith, who is a witch and knows the ways of magic, is pretty much the only one who can see what exactly this superstore will do, and also that the representative from the chain who has come to the town is something not quite human, and definitely insidious. But the town views Judith as like the local crazy lady, and no one believes her at all. So Judith ends up eventually teaming up with and enlisting the help of the other 2 main characters in this book, who are younger women named Lizzie and Autumn. Judith comes to Lizzie because Lizzie is the relatively new town vicar, and Lizzie is struggling with some of her own issues of faith following the death of her boyfriend. And then the third character here, Autumn, has opened a magic shop in town for magical supplies, but she isn't really a believer the way Judith is, and Judith sort of looks down at her as, you know, a fake. It turns out that Autumn had an encounter with the Fae that left her pretty traumatized, and she has allowed herself to be convinced that she had some sort of mental illness, that it wasn't real. And she sees a sort of superficial belief in magic as a way to process her trauma and to seek healing. But since it turns out that she has had real experience with the magical world, if she can be convinced that that really did happen to her and that there is a real magical threat looming over Lychford, she could actually be a whole lot of a help. Lizzie and Autumn have some backstory with each other as friends whose friendship got broken off for reasons that neither of them really understands. They've both changed a lot, they've both been through things, and they have some reconciliation to do. And then Judith sort of realizes that she probably shouldn't have waited so long to take on mentees of a younger generation and to pass on her knowledge, but she can make up for lost time, maybe, and do that now if it's not too late to save the town. So I think the thing that this had going for it that was most up my alley was that sort of like trio of female characters with different strengths figuring out how to work together. And as I said, I don't really have any complaints about this book. It just wasn't as exciting as I hoped it would be. I think there was definitely a lost opportunity for some humor in the idea of like a literally demonic superstore from hell. Like, I don't know how or why that concept was pulled off completely straight-faced. I would not have been able to resist making jokes. I gave this book 3 stars. I will continue on and read the second book in the series because I already own it. But if I didn't already have the second book on hand, I don't think this is a series that I would be feeling compelled to continue on with. So the next book I have to talk about is probably the reason that this was failing in comparison while I was reading these 2 books side by side in the mythic urban fantasy department, and that is The Onion Girl by Charles de Lint. Now, Charles de Lint is really known for being kind of a pioneer of a brand of mythic urban fantasy that I feel like something like this is just kind of a bit of a watered down version of. This is one of his Newford books that take place in the fictional North American city of Newford that for the most part can be read out of order. This is the first full Newford book I have picked up. I'd previously read and loved a short story that focuses on a couple of the main characters in this book. But this is not where most fans, I think, would recommend starting with the Newford series, because it does bring in a lot of characters that you can tell have all of this backstory. And it didn't matter to me all that much that I could tell that there was backstory there that I didn't know, but I think you might enjoy it more if you were already a fan and knew about all of these people. I think there are a couple of books following this one that do need to be read in order after this one, and I also own one of those, which is part of the reason I started here, and also because I think this is the book of de Lint's that has been on my shelves the longest. But this book I had actually been reading for months by the time that I finished it in November. So a lot of my memories of like the first half of the book are probably very, very foggy. It took me a long time to read, not because I wasn't enjoying it, but because it does feel like a much more slowly paced book than some of the other things I was reading at the time, and a lot of things I was reading when I picked this up were much higher priority because I had reasons I needed to finish them. So I sort of let this be something that I was reading in the background over a period of many months. I know that for a lot of people, making slow progress in a book or not finishing it quickly is a sign that something isn't working for them in that book and that it's time to DNF, and that is not the case with me. So this is about a woman named Jilly who is sort of a beacon of light in her community. She is an artist, and she's someone who has used her life to do a lot of good and to touch a lot of people. She's also a strong believer in the otherworldly happenings of Lychford. She sort of sees and understands the magic in the stories of the people who surround her. And people who interact with her seem to always see her as being sort of sprightly and mysterious and kind of a little fae. But at the beginning of this book, Jilly has been hit by a car, she's been partially paralyzed, she's in really bad shape, and she's in the hospital. And so there are basically two major storylines in this book. One is focused on Jilly in the hospital and all of the people in her orbit who care about her and want the best for her, and how while she's in the hospital, she finds her way into the Dreamlands while she sleeps. And the Dreamlands are this other world that one of her best friends, Sophie, goes to on the regular when she sleeps. But Sophie isn't really the sort of magical believer that Jilly is, and so Jilly has been jealous of Sophie's ability to get there. So Jilly finds herself able now to enter the Dreamlands where, you know, in her Dreamland body, she's well, she's healthy, she can draw, she can do all of these things that she can't do in the real world, where she starts calling herself, her body there in the hospital, the broken girl. And there's this struggle for her of wanting to just run away and escape into the Dreamlands and leaving her physical self behind, but she is going to need to come back to herself and face the real consequences of what's happened to her if she's going to get better. I love the way the Dreamlands are portrayed in this book as sort of this universal otherworld that has a lot of different faces. It is perhaps fairy, but this is also North America, and there are some Native American characters in this book, and for them it is a spirit world that is centered around their mythology. It is vast and mythic, and it is a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It is a place where stories are real, perhaps the place where all stories are real. The other major storyline that we spend a lot of time with in this book is connected to Jilly's past. And in this one, we're following her sister, Raylene, whom Jilly hasn't told anyone about. She hasn't really told anyone about the life that she fled, the abusive childhood that she had. And that side of the story is genuinely tough to read because of all of the horrific things that happen. It's really about the desolation and the hopelessness and the cycles of poverty and crime. And this is what Jilly escaped from, because even though she was dealt a really bad hand of cards in life, she was eventually able to get help and start over and turn her life around and start giving back. But she does feel guilt about having left her younger sister behind. And we learn that things have not gone so well for Raylene. She has not had a good life, she's gotten into some really bad stuff, and it's turned her into a very destructive person. So whereas Jilly is sort of seen in the magical, mystical sense as this, having this inner light that she radiates, Raylene is kind of the opposite, this dark light, this dark force, because of all of that destructive energy that she has. It takes a long time following Raylene's, essentially her entire life story, to get to the point where it starts to interact with what's happening with Jilly. Basically, Raylene finds her own way into the Dreamlands, and what she experiences there and what she does there is very different. So as a first real foray into novel-length Charles de Lint, this blew me away in a lot of ways. There are a few niggling things that got on my nerves a bit, where I couldn't give it 5 stars. First of all, Raylene's chapters just being hard to read because there is so much bad stuff that happens in them. The other is this thing that must have been a trope in the 2000s or something. This was published in 2001, and I sort of remember reading books that kind of did the same thing in high school, so it kind of brought me back, where the implication is that if someone is like physically injured or something like physically damaging or disabling has happened to them, then like they need to have this inner journey where they need to heal all the things in their past and confront their darkest nightmares or whatever before they can start to heal physically. And maybe it's because I hadn't read a book like that in a really long time that it sort of stuck out to me as like, oh, that's a thing. I think it does end up being a lot more complicated than that in this book, but the way it was presented at the beginning a few times felt very, very cliched. But Charles Lint is an author whose books I've been hoarding for a really long time because I always thought I would really like them, and I feel so glad to be reaffirmed in my belief that his books would be for me. I think that the way he sort of blends the fantastical and the mythic with real-world issues is really exceptional, and the writing is just so, so strong. So going on, I think I am going to go back and start reading Lychford in publication order, because I have the first couple books. Dreams Underfoot, which is a short story collection, and then Memory and Dream, which is the first novel. And then the third book, I think, is another short story collection, that's The Ivory and the Horn, which I also own. So I think the next Lychford books I'm going to read are going to be those in that order, and I'm hoping that I will get to those when this is still fresh enough in my memory that I will be able to sort of retroactively put the pieces together when I see characters who came up in this. But I may have to reread this when I've read more Lychford in the future to pick up on all the nuances and details of all of these characters' stories. So the next book I have to talk about is one that I returned to the library after I read it, and that is Aquicorn Cove by Katie O'Neill, which is like a middle grade-ish graphic novel. I think Katie O'Neill's art style is super, super cute. Her stories are incredibly wholesome. I did not like this quite as much as The Tea Dragon Society, which was a 5-star read for me, but I still enjoyed it a lot. It is, however, something that I am thinking of differently looking back at it after all these months, because it does deal significantly with grief after the death of the main character's mother, and that is something where, like, I would not choose to pick this up right now for myself because that would just be too close to home. That said, this did end up getting nominated for the BookTube SFF Awards in the graphic novel category, which I'm super happy about because I did in fact nominate it. So a lot of other booktubers have been reading it over the last month or so. So I've seen a bunch of other people talking about this in their recent wrap-ups. And I think that what I have to say on it is probably pretty similar to what some of the other booktubers who've talked about this recently have said. So this is about a young girl and her father who have moved away from a small seaside community after the death of the mother, and the father really doesn't want to stay in this place where they lived by the sea anymore, but the young girl misses it incredibly, and she feels very at home here, in a way that it's sort of implied in little flashbacks that she doesn't feel like in the city. But they are back in town visiting the girl's aunt to help with some cleanup after a big storm. And a lot of this story sort of ends up being about environmental stewardship in a sort of educational way. What you sort of discover over the course of the story is a sort of magical explanation for how people's disregard of the environment has caused there to be more storms. And it's sort of like an easy shortcut for talking about like global warming and climate change and pollution and threats to coral reefs without actually having to go into the science of how those things work. This is a sort of magical world way to sort of condense it down. And I think that was a great theme for this graphic novel to tackle for younger readers, but for an adult audience it was kind of oversimplistic. What I liked more about this story was really the sort of character dynamics and relationships. I think Katie O'Neill does those in a really subtle, beautiful way that's very lovely. There's the relationship between the girl, Lana, and her aunt, and then there's also these flashbacks of the aunt's relationship with a magical underwater sea woman. It's a sort of lovely fairy tale-ish female-female love story between the fisherwoman and the magical underwater custodian of the reef, who's also like the guardian of the Aquicorns, which are these cool creatures. And that's a relationship that we learn has broken off, but then gets mended through, you know, the sort of environmental resolution to the story. And through it all, Lana is learning things about herself and who she is as someone who wants to be a sort of caretaker for the things around her in the world. So this was sweet, highly recommended. I gave it 4 stars. And then the last thing I have to talk about is another full-length novel, and that is Spinning Silver by Naomi Novik. This was interesting for me because, of course, I was, like everyone else, sort of comparing it a bit to Uprooted, which it was this author's previous standalone fairy tale-ish fantasy novel. But I was also comparing it to the short story version of this story that I read, that this is an expansion upon that short story version appeared in the Starlit Wood anthology, which I read and really liked. To me, this feels much more genuinely fairy tale-ish than Uprooted. I enjoyed Uprooted, but it ended up being something different than what I expected it to be. It ended up being a much more traditional fantasy novel, and I just enjoyed it as that. This is actually digging into fairy tale story elements in a way that I don't think Uprooted really did. The short story version definitely worked on its own as a Rumpelstiltskin retelling, one that centered the idea of paying your debts by having a main character, Miriam, who is the daughter of a pretty terrible moneylender who takes over her father's business and becomes quite a good moneylender herself. One day she makes a brag in the woods that she can turn silver into gold, and the magical beings called the Steric hear her, and she's forced to make good on that in a much more literal way. And through it is this idea that there's historically been this storytelling trope of villainizing the moneylender, which can manifest as anti-Semitism. Rumpelstiltskin, of course, being sort of the magical moneylender in that fairy tale, and then the maiden gets out of paying her debt to him. The short story version was very non-specific in terms of setting, so to me that felt way more fairy tale-ish than anything else I've read from Naomi Novik, in that it felt like it took place in a once upon a time type setting. The characters, who are pretty clearly Jewish, were not explicitly labeled as such in the story, nor were the Christian characters. The kingdom that it took place in didn't seem to have any specific, name or setting. And I think you lose a little of that in the novel, where you have to have a more fully realized fantasy kingdom for all the threads of this story to work. And the Jewish characters are also explicitly called Jews, except that it's also sort of explicitly a secondary fantasy world. So I think you sort of have to let that be water under the bridge and accept that that doesn't make total sense. The other thing that feels less fairy tale-ish and more straightforward fantasy about the novelization is the Steric. The place where the short story ended, it allowed the whole Steric fantasy, sort of fae element of it, to remain completely mysterious and otherworldly and beyond human understanding. Basically, about a third of the way through the book is the point where the short story version ended, and something in the novel happens differently at that point in the story, and it starts the whole rest of the story happening. But it also means that we spend a significant amount of time in this book in the Steric kingdom, experiencing their sort of court and society in almost more of a fantasy of manners way, because they have a lot of social rules that are very, very different from what Miriam is used to. But while Miriam's storyline is the only storyline in the short story, the novel has 2 other main storylines, and I think a total of 5 point-of-view characters. There's Wanda, who's a girl from the town that Miriam lives in, whom she employs to help with the money-lending business. She's got 2 brothers and a very abusive, drunk father. And there's also Irina, who is a noblewoman whose father is trying to arrange for her to marry the Tsar through perhaps slightly unscrupulous means. And both of these characters showed up in the short story, but we never got their points of view and we never really learned what happened to them. You can sort of obviously see another thread riffing on the Rumpelstiltskin themes in Irina's storyline, and I do think that as the book progresses, it becomes less and less of a straightforward retelling, but more of an examination and a continued riff upon different aspects of the Rumpelstiltskin story, kind of continuously re-examining the themes of Rumpelstiltskin from a lot of different angles. You do, I think, also see some fairy tale indicators that are borrowed from different fairy tales popping up as well. For example, Wanda has like a magical tree that she goes to for advice that is somehow connected to her dead mother, and that seems like it's kind of lifted from Cinderella. And there were some other things like that that I noticed that I don't remember as clearly throughout the book. And it is definitely something that I sort of just sat back and enjoyed reading as a fantasy story, but then whenever I actually stopped to think about it and like go back to think about the fairy tale that it's based on, I could sort of see more and more layers of how Naomi Novik was using the ideas of the fairy tale in a lot of different ways. And that made this, for me, in a lot of ways, as someone who really enjoys engaging with fairy tale story themes, a more rewarding read than Uprooted. Most strongly, I think this is a story about 3 young women who start out having essentially no bargaining power of their own, but they each find their own ways to manufacture their own bargaining power, to make themselves valuable and to assert their worth. I've heard some discussion about whether or not the point of view switches in this book are difficult to follow or not. I think they are pretty clear. They're not hard to follow, but they're done in a way that sort of defies convention, so it can be a little jarring. There are often point of view switches within the chapter where you just have like an extra line break, and then you're on to someone else's point of view. I think that's a little unusual. So you don't have like whole chapters from one person's point of view most of the time. And then you also don't have like a label of who's talking. So I don't think it's confusing. I think it's always pretty clear once you've realized that there's been a point of view switch, whose point of view you're reading from, but I don't know why those switches weren't done in a more conventional way, like having a whole chapter for, you know, a single character at a time. Or even by like putting the character's name at the front of each section where you have a change. You do sort of add more point of view characters as the book goes on. They're the main 3, and then 2 others who are sort of secondary characters in 2 of the storylines who eventually become point of view characters themselves. I was sort of back and forth in my mind about whether those last 2 were really necessary, given that they aren't main characters, and I think only 2 of the 3 storylines got a second point of view perspective, but you know, I didn't really have a problem with it. I do think there were some things that felt like they kind of happened abruptly out of nowhere at the end, specifically where sort of romance is involved. You have not 1 but 2 different pairings in this book that are sort of the same dynamic that Naomi Novik seems to like to write from Uprooted, where you have like a protagonist girl who becomes involved in, like, a magical mystery man. You have sort of two of those pairings in this book that aren't romancy at all until, like, the very end where something changes. And then you're sort of supposed to accept that there's going to be some happily ever after here way too quickly for me. But if you thought there was, like, too much of the angsty romance in Uprooted, there is far less of it throughout the majority of this book. It just doesn't happen until, like, the end where poof, poof, there it was. So I think this was more to my taste than Uprooted, but, like, the short story version would have been like a 5-star short story for me, and this was only a 4-star novel. I think that was a little scattered, but I want to be done filming this wrap-up, so I think I'm just going to say that I'm done. So these were some of the books that I read in November. Let me know if you've read any of these, what you think. I hope to be back soon with another wrap-up of some sort. Anyhow, I hope you're having a nice day. That is all. Bye for now.